we're happy to do this collaboration with Race Before Race and ACMRS. So very fortuitous to have some wonderful speakers here with us today. And it's a really great opportunity to think about your writing ahead of time. So it's not like, oh, I've finished my book, now what should I do with it? It's probably a good idea to kind of check in with some presses ahead of time and get a sense of and establish relationships with the press. There are a lot of steps involved in this, and we have some incredible speakers here to help you out with some of that. So we'll have Jade Groden, who's the commissioning editor of the Arden Shakespeare series at Bloomsbury Academic, which has long set the standard in annotated scholarly editions of Shakespeare's plays. Previously, Jade was the assistant editor at Sage Publishing. And then we have Amy Tan. She's the associate editor of the University of Pennsylvania Press. And her areas of acquisition are ranging, ethnography, anthropology, political studies. And she's worked to acquire and expand Penn's longstanding Middle Age series, as well as Race Before Race. And then finally, Mahinder Kingra will join us via Zoom as the editorial director of Cornell University Press. His primary areas of acquisition is medieval studies, history, literature, and art, as well as publicly engaged scholars, identity and practices, and then practices, religion and conflict series, the humanities and public in policy, politics and law, as well as a number of other series for Cornell. So they'll each give a small presentation, and then there'll be ample time for a question and answer. So thank you for joining us.
Oh yeah, so no choice.
Great. Yeah, so thanks for coming to hear about all of our different publishing programs today. It's great to be able to speak to you alongside Mahinder and Jenny. And it's such a great center for medieval and Renaissance studies. Thanks to the Institute for Humanities Research at ASU specifically for hosting this event. Yeah, so as Ron said, I'm Jade Groden and I work on the Arden Shakespeare imprint as commissioning editor. So I'm just going to talk a bit about the press specifically before we go into a more general how to get published section. Arden Shakespeare, for those of you who don't know, has its own publishing program and is over 100 years old. We sit under the wider company of Bloomsbury Academic that publishes a broad range of humanities and social science research across different subjects. So ranging from music and sound studies to linguistics, history, classics, biblical studies, and film. The Arden team, we're based in London, but we have offices in New York, New Delhi, and Australia as well. So there are 3 editors on our team, myself and Mark Dudgeon. We both commission in early modern culture and Shakespeare studies. Don't know how many of you here today are working in those areas, but hopefully some of you, so you can talk a bit more to me afterwards. And yeah, alongside our critical studies publishing that we both do, we have, as you can see here, our long-standing Arden editions of the plays, which go back 100 years. And yeah, we're actually bringing out the 4th series from 2024 onwards, which is going to create new scholarly editions of all these classic Shakespeare plays for students and scholars. And yeah, alongside this play publishing, we've got a lot of critical studies publishing, which covers like research handbooks on adaptation, performance. And then we also have newer book series. I'm just going to show you a few from this series, which is called Arden Shakespeare Intersections. The books in this series take a single word like text, sex, and sense to explore new directions in scholarship in Shakespeare studies that dispense with dated categories of analysis and platform cutting edge ideas. So that's where scholars, students like yourselves come in. Part of the reason for attending Race Before Race at ASU is that we are especially keen to meet early career academics who would like to publish with us as contributors, authors, and editors. At Arden, we see ourselves as working with scholars, not just at the start of their careers, but throughout the whole of their lives as researchers. Many scholars who published their early research with us in the form of academic monographs have gone on to edit Arden plays, so the full series coming out, as I said. We remain committed to having a strong presence in the world of Shakespeare and early modern studies, and are keen to attend events, smaller conferences like Race Before Race that address inequities in scholarly research and its publication. We also attend the bigger conferences that you'll know of, like SAA, where we can meet potential new authors and all of our existing editors and authors too. As a publishing team, we want to continue to remove any barriers to publication that scholars of colour and people from marginalized identities disproportionately face in academia. As part of the current Arden 4th series, you might be interested to know, we've set up an advisory board of more junior academics who shadow and collaborate in the play editing process with our series general editors, exploring relevant scholarship on Shakespeare and race, sexuality, and gender. Our 4th series also includes leading scholars of early modern studies working in said fields who are creating new editions of classic plays that will establish themselves for the next generation of readers. So we have Ayanna Thompson doing Titus Andronicus, Patricia Akimi doing Othello, for example. So we want to continue doing this work and publish research that reaches a broad audience of scholars, students, and practitioners. I was just going to do a brief bit about reaching out to us. At Arden, we have a standard proposal form on our website that gives academics a chance to go into detail about their book ideas and the research they're based on. This tends to consist of like detailed outlines and abstracts that cover the whole of your project, along with a critical survey of the research your book is in conversation with, as well as an academic biography. But before you get to this stage, we're always happy to talk about our publishing process and any ideas you want to work through, especially if it's something that might reach a wider audience, is not just a standard academic monograph. But yeah, maybe we can go into a bit more on that in the publishing process bit that we do. So that's all. Yeah.
Are my slides just after? Hi. Oh. Is this mic working or am I just too short? Okay. Okay. Hi, I'm Jenny Tan. I am an acquiring editor at Penn Press. I'll try and keep my part of this short in the interest of time, but for anyone who's interested, I'm happy to share more information about Penn, including other editors whose acquisitions areas might be more relevant to you. I acquire in medieval and early modern studies, literature through the 18th century, as well as anthropology and ethnography, nowadays primarily in race, social justice, activism, and education. And I'm also interested in interdisciplinary work that is related, even if scholars might not necessarily identify strictly with those fields. Penn Press itself, we are a university press incorporated in 1890. We seek to publish about 18 to 10 books a year. We also have a journals program. We do roughly 30 journals. I would say, in addition to my acquisitions areas, key areas of interest for the press are literary and cultural studies, American history, particularly early American and Atlantic and Black history, religion, Jewish studies, human rights, anthropology, particularly concerning political violence, migration, and social issues. We also are a press of many series, of which I'll share more information about a couple. One is Race Before Race, Critical Studies of the Pre-Modern, hosted by our own ACMRS, and co-edited by Ayanna Thompson, who's here. And these are just, there's no information on these slides other than just some covers of recent and forthcoming books that I'm very excited about, both the books and the covers. Let's see. This is another of our long-standing series, one which I work on, The Middle Ages, and some other forthcoming books that represent areas that I'm particularly interested in and excited about. We also have numerous other series, Sound and History, Jewish Cultures and Contexts, Early American Studies, Politics and Culture in Modern America, many of which are shepherded by my colleagues. I would say areas of interest that the areas that the press is interested in growing across all of our humanities publishing, I would say in particular are environmental studies and the environmental humanities, Black studies, building on our Black history list. For example, we have a new series that is still in the works, not sort of officially out in the world yet, but a new series on Black print culture, which is building on numerous areas that have historically been of interest to the press. Another one of our longstanding series is material texts, also one that's interested in material culture across a number of different historical periods and cultures, as well as queer studies and sexuality studies. And here's just a few more pen books that I think represent a good range of things that we're particularly excited about right now. So I will stop there and pass things along to Mahinder.
All right. Hi there. I'm not sure if I'm going to share my screen or not, but anyway, oh, there we go. Do you want me to share it? Can I do it from here?
Yeah, you should have the freedom to do that.
All right, it says host has disabled screen sharing. Probably wise given my disastrous screen sharing times in the past. And while this is getting set up, I want to thank ASU for inviting me. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. I'm in my last day of COVID protocols. It's been a bit of a rough week. I'm feeling a little better today, and I have my voice today, which is nice. And I'm sorry not to be there, not least of which because it's 30 degrees warmer in Tempe than it is here in Ithaca. Let's see, no, not yet. I can start talking, and my slides aren't that interesting. So I'm the editor-in-chief, editorial director at Cornell University Press. Cornell was established in 1869. Oh, hi, sorry, I have to turn around. Making it the first university press in the US. We are not the oldest, however, because we were dormant for about 3 decades at the start of the 20th century. And today we publish 175 books a year, and we have more than 5,000 books in print. Oh, there we go. There we go. And if everyone can see that, that's the screen I want to share. Good. And these are, again, just for background. So the books we publish cover 30 disciplines, from archaeology and classics to political science and urban studies. And we attend about as many conferences, which, as we'll discuss later in the sort of Q&A portion, is an excellent place to meet with our editors and begin conversations about publishing with Cornell. Let's see. There we go. Open access is a major focus at Cornell, and we currently have, it says nearly 200, but actually since that slide was made, we have almost 250 open access titles in print, from deep backlist titles that we brought back into print through a grant from the NEH to the latest works of scholarship. We probably do somewhere between 5 and 10 open access books a year. And let's see, so this is my attempt to diagram Cornell structure. Like every member of the Association of University Presses, every book we publish is approved by a faculty board. And unlike many university presses, however, Cornell has multiple faculty boards, each one responsible for authorizing books published under one of our 7 imprints, which is a huge amount of imprints. The main humanities and social sciences imprint is simply Cornell University Press. But under different imprints, we publish different kinds of books. So Comstock is our life sciences imprint. ILR is our industrial and labor relations imprint. Three Hills is our sort of general readership for books about New York City and state and the Northeast region more generally. We have 2 imprints devoted to Southeast Asian studies and to East Asian studies. And about 3 years ago, we acquired Northern Illinois University Press, which specializes in Slavic studies, politics and philosophy, and the Midwest region. And they have their own separate board based in DeKalb. And within all of these imprints are some 35 active series, each with their own editors, and many of them have their own advisory boards as well. So all of these books, imprints, and series are managed by a team of 9 acquisitions editors. Each one is responsible for at least a couple of these subject areas. I do medieval studies. I've recently handed off literature to one of my colleagues, but I'm currently handling the Three Hills imprint, which is the New York general interest, because that editor recently left to take up a position somewhere else. So as editor-in-chief, I also sort of get thrown all the books that nobody else doesn't fit into anyone else's profile. So for example, I did a book on the Beatles a couple of years ago that came in. It was very attractive, but I'm the only Beatles expert on staff, so I got to do that one. In getting approval for books, and this is sort of part of the process, sort of behind the scenes, in getting approval for books that we as editors would like to publish, this group, so there's 5 people on this list and 4 here, these are all the editors, meet weekly with the press's director, managing editor, marketing director, and finance manager to present book projects that have been peer reviewed, usually by 2 external readers, and for which we have created basic budgets and rationales for why we want to publish them. This weekly meeting is known as pre-board at Cornell, but is known as the decision to publish meeting at some other university presses, is where we discuss the intellectual merits of each project and assess their financial viability. One other aspect of this meeting that's really helpful, and I think maybe a little unusual among university presses, is that at this stage, each project is assigned a copy editor, and that copy editor then reads the manuscript to look for potential issues that might come up in the production process. Are the citations consistent? Are there weird structural issues? Is the author writing in a passive voice? Will there a lot of, how much intervention is going to be needed at that stage? All of this gets put into a form that we send back to the authors ahead of contract, just so they know how their book will sort of go through the process afterwards. And then after this weekly meeting, if a book succeeds at this meeting, it then goes on to one of the faculty board meetings. And the faculty boards then decide whether we should issue a contract for the project. And sometimes they also offer their own opinions about the project, depending on their expertise. Sometimes we have the project and the faculty board member line up precisely. Sometimes it's a stretch. And so that can sort of differentiate the kind of responses we get on projects. And then after that meeting, we go on to contract and then eventual publication. So I think Jade and Jenny and I are going to be talking more about the specifics of actually getting to that process, but that's sort of how things happen at Cornell. Thank you.
Yeah, so the 3 of us had prepared some questions that we thought would broadly be of interest, and hopefully, we won't go on for too long, and then we would like to open questions up to you all. But these were just some things that commonly come up as we speak to authors and prospective authors. So one thing we had on our list, how should you approach an editor about your book project and at what stage of the process? Do one of you want to start with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to go?
Go ahead. Sure. No, you go first, Jade.
Okay. What was it? When should you approach? Yeah.
Yeah. How should you approach an editor and at what stage?
Yeah. So I guess I'll just speak specifically to Arden. When academics approach us, they tend to have written up most of their research and kind of be at quite an advanced stage in terms of what the book is going to be. So we have our standard proposal form, but we're kind of happy to talk to academics and scholars before they write up the proposal form, if it'd be helpful. That's something that I've been doing with early career scholars who I've been working with off of some outreach that I did at like a smaller conference, and they kind of wanted to talk about the proposal form a bit more than someone maybe who's more established in their academic career would when approaching a press. So I think it kind of depends on how much support you've had from your university, the academics who you work with in terms of when you get in touch with the press. But I do think it makes sense to be at quite an advanced stage with your research, just so that you come across as kind of understanding the market and where you're publishing. That's why it's a good idea to look at the book catalogue for the academic publisher that you're interested in. Just make sure that your research is kind of in conversation with that, on the same level, you know, in terms of the people that they're publishing and where they're at in their academic careers as well. Is kind of a good way to get a sense of where you should be when you approach also.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think probably the primary way that scholars send their projects to me is a proposal and a cover letter. Sometimes though, it's just an email sort of saying, is this a project that you'd be interested in? And at that point, I'm happy to write back and say, yeah, this sounds great, send me a proposal, or you know what, that's just not going to fit into my lists. And I think it's important for sort of, especially first-time authors, to know that I'm not like the proposal for me is not a make or break. I mean, if I'm interested in the project and there are a couple typos in the proposal, for example, I'm still going to be interested in the project. And if it's a beautifully prepared proposal with everything you could want, but it's just not a project that I think that Cornell will do a good job of publishing, either we don't attend the primary conference, or it sort of falls outside, or it's a field that we used to publish in and we no longer publish in, then the quality of the proposal, you know, doesn't matter. And I will, you know, I'll just have to decline anyway. And so I'm also happy if I read a proposal and I think I need more on the proposal, to, especially if I'm trying to persuade my colleagues that this is a book we should do, then I'll write back to the author and we, you know, I'll say, this is great, but could you, you know, section 7 of your proposal is a little vague, or I'm still not quite sure how what other books your project is in conversation with. Could you give a more robust list of competing titles? And then finally, for me, I'm sort of pleased that the in-person conferences have returned, although I'm not there now, because I think quick conversations with editors are also really helpful. You know, even unscheduled ones where, like the big medieval conference, which is at Kalamazoo, I'll be scheduled most throughout the day. But if someone stops by the Cornell stand and they say, hey, listen, do you have 5 minutes? And I do, and they're like, I'm thinking of doing a book on this. I can then at that point say, oh, that sounds great. Send me a proposal when you have one. Let's set aside time to talk later in the conference. Let's do a Zoom when we get back. Or, you know what, that's not something I really, it's not something I think Cornell would be good at publishing, but why don't you try Jenny? She's just down the hallway.
Yeah, those are great answers. And I would just add to that, I think it's important to distinguish whether you're making an informal or formal approach. If it's a sort of informal conversation, I'm happy to talk to authors at any phase of the project. Obviously, it's hard to, you can't really make a commitment at that early of a stage, but just to sort of answer general questions about fit, what the press does, what you're working on, what sort of publishing considerations there might be. I would say for something more formal, I like to hear about projects and see a proposal at a stage when your sense of what the book is fully formed. Sometimes I see proposals that read a little bit more like a prospectus, in the sense that it sounds like you're writing about a future project and not a book that already exists, even if still mentally and not yet totally on paper. And that kind of proposal seems a little premature, because it's hard for me to make a decision about that, other than, great, I'd like to see more, or, maybe it's for us, maybe it's not for us. This one. Should I just ask the question?
Sure.
Okay. How should you go about selecting a publisher for your book project, and how many publishers should you be pitching it to at the same time? Okay, I'll start with that one. Now Now I just feel like I'm asking myself questions. So I would say, a good place to start is to see, who has been publishing books like yours or books that you've been citing in the last 5 years or so. I would say that last 5 years caveat is important because presses, acquisitions areas and priorities can change, especially as personnel come and go. Conferences and book exhibits, I think, are really great places to get a sense of what's coming out in your field, what people are excited about, and then also who is publishing those books. Talking to editors at conferences can be great, but I also find that non-editor staff who are at the booths often also have a really valuable perspective on sort of what their particular press is interested in. And maybe, to the question of how many publishers you should be pitching to at the same time, I would say at the sort of proposal stage, it's accepted and, expected that you might be in conversation with many publishers. At the same time, I would suggest, if you have a really clear first choice, talk to that press first. I've talked to authors who've said like, oh, I sent my proposal out to 5 different presses and you are my first choice, but this other press, like sent my materials out for review already. What do I do? So, if you're not under that kind of time pressure, I would say, think about, who's your first choice. Maybe if you have a second choice, think about your order of priority and, those presses down the line that would be interested will still be interested down the line. There's not usually a need to, send it to every potentially interested party at the same time.
Yeah, I wouldn't really add much to that. It's a perfect answer. I mean, at Arden, we actually don't consider proposals, well, Bloomsbury in general, that are under review elsewhere, just to not duplicate on review work. But yeah, I agree. If you've got a first choice, then go with them. And yeah, it's a good way to not have any duplication of work or different reviews even that could be confusing for your project. You can end up getting quite varied feedback in terms of the presses and who they go out to, and it really shapes the development of your project, the review feedback that you get. So I think it is worth having that first choice and following it through in terms of their process. But that's just for us. Like, yeah, other press is different, obviously.
Yeah, and I would, to the first part, how do you select a publisher? I agree with everything that both Jenny and Jade have said. For me, if there's a critical meeting that you think your book should be at, and the publisher is not going to that meeting, do not submit it to that publisher in the hopes that maybe they will one day attend. For example, we get a lot of really interesting Latin American studies projects, and I would love to publish some of them, but we have never attended LASA, and we are probably just not going to attend LASA because we don't have a critical mass of titles. And so you will be disappointed if you're hoping to see your book at LASA or geography. And so I would look to see, and it's not simply that, oh, you're going to sell 100 copies of your book at LASA. That's probably not going to happen, but it does indicate the investment that the publisher has made in that field. And that means how familiar they are to the journals in the field and the scholars in the field. So that's one way. And then I would say, look at the active series that are being published and see if your book would fit into one of those series, and make sure that they are active, because I have had many submissions where it's a series that we shut down, 10 years before. And there haven't been any new books since, 2008. So pay attention to that. And as to, how many publishers to pitch, I agree. Send proposals. I mean, in my own brain, I couldn't keep straight more than 4 or 5 at any one time. So that's probably would be my maximum. And in part do that because, for example, right now I'm so busy, I'm having a hard time replying to proposals. And so you might not just hear from an editor, not because your project's not really great, but just because they're taking, doing other things. And so if you're waiting, you sent it to one publisher and you're waiting and waiting, that's less than ideal. So if you send it to 4 or 5, someone may get back to you. At that point, you might write to your top choice and say, hey, listen, I just heard back from Cornell, Jenny, but I really want to publish with you. Will you have time to review my proposal? And then of course, once the editor says, yeah, this is great, I want to send the manuscript out for review, or I'm planning on sending a manuscript out for review, that's the point where you might let, depending on how active and interested the other editors you've sent the project to have been, that's the point where you say, listen, just so you know, it's under review at Penn now. So I'm going to formally, I actually had people say I'm formally withdrawing my proposal. You don't need to do that, but if I'm sort of on the fence thinking I might send it out for review, just let the editor know, hey, listen, someone else is sending out for review now. It's been great. If that doesn't work out, I might come back to you.
The next question we had. Yeah, I would say, I think it's at the proposal stage, it's a good courtesy to let people know. I think for me, I'm usually just the fact that the book is under review or the proposal is being considered by multiple presses is enough. If you want to name the presses, that's great. If you don't want to, that's also fine. I don't think that disclosure is, I can't speak for everyone and say that, it's necessary, but I do find, it can sometimes be disorienting to, reply to someone and then they say like, oh, it's already out for review somewhere else. And then sometimes they're like, oh, but you were my first choice. And I'm like, well, then sorry, I had no way to know that was the situation.
Once the book is under review, does it then move on the author to kind of reach out to others? So it's under review or?
Yeah, I think generally expects, as Mahinder was saying, that once you get that feedback that says we will send it out for review to, just to not duplicate on the work and to make sure you're following the project through with one publisher.
Okay. So the next question we had, what should every author know about preparing their book proposals and their manuscripts?
I'm happy to start this one. Sorry, I know everyone has to turn around to. Preparing their book proposals and their manuscripts. As we said before, I think you really want to prepare your book proposal when you're at a stage where you know what the book is going to look like, because at least, I think that most or a lot of publishers have a sort of, this is what your proposal should look like. This is the information it contain. And one of the key parts for me as an editor in reviewing a project is the annotated table of contents, which tells me how the argument is developed, what the argument is at the beginning, how it's developed through the chapters. Is there a conclusion? What's that conclusion going to do? And so having a real sense, obviously, it doesn't mean that you've written the manuscript, and obviously things might change through the peer review process, through your discussions with your editor or with colleagues. But having a real sense of at that stage what you think the book is going to be like, how long it's going to be in terms of words, if there are going to be illustrations, especially if they're going to be color illustrations, that changes the game a lot, and the sort of the kind of books that would be it would be competing with in the market, or contrasting with, and that list of books is really helpful. The sort of other books that cover, that my book is speaking to is really helpful, at least again for me, for two reasons. One, it lets us do some market research. So if you have 5 books on there and all, 3 of them have sold really well, they've been well reviewed, they've won awards, that's really encouraging. And that gives us a sense of what the readership for your project might be. And also it knows what kind of readers you're imagining for your book, what fields they're in, if they're, if it's across disciplines, and also maybe peer reviewers we might reach out to are the authors of those books. So I'll stop there on the project.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, some sort of helpful nuts and bolts things, in addition to images, which Mahinder mentioned, also things like manuscript length, which publishers conceive of in terms of word count, not page count. That's something that's important for us to know, and also important for you to consider throughout every stage of the process. That's something where it can be helpful to, ask around with friends who have some experience in this realm, or, you know, ask editors who you are working with or interested in working with. Expectations can really vary across different disciplines, but for example, in medieval and early modern studies, you know, 100,000 words is a pretty typical length. Even longer is, you know, definitely fairly typical, you know, whereas, you know, if you're submitting a proposal in anthropology and it's 120,000 words, you know, that's about, you know, twice as long as it possibly could be. So having that sort of expectation in mind, right, I would say like an anthropology book, I would expect to see more along the lines of, you know, 80,000 words or maybe slightly more or a little bit less. But just knowing that kind of thing in advance when you're at the proposal stage, and knowing that it's something that you'll have to pay attention to, for example, as you're working on your final manuscript and now you have a contractual word count.
Yeah, I guess just to reiterate that for us, the academic proposal is kind of an extraction from the academic project that already exists. So you kind of work backwards from the project and the research that you've done. Tends to be the way that we approach it. And that means that you have a very detailed, competent, comprehensive proposal that's already had academic feedback through your supervisors and your colleagues in whatever area that you work in. So I think that can be a good way to approach it in terms of thinking about the academic book proposal, which is quite different from how people tend to think of proposals just for trade books or something. So
And I would just add that one of the questions I get a lot is, well, what if I've published 2 chapters or parts of 2 chapters that are going into this book have already been published? Should I not tell you that? Is that a problem? And for me, it's almost never a problem. In, you know, most of the books we publish, some part of it will have been published in journal form or article form before. But, you know, if it's, say, 2 out of the 5 chapters, to me, that's not a problem, because it basically means that there's already an audience waiting for the book that will be there when the book is published, and also that at least parts of this book have already been peer reviewed, and perhaps even more strenuously than they are at the book level, you know, journal article. So that, you know, I see that as, oh, that's great. This is a scholar who is connected. People know their work. People may be waiting for the book length version of this. You know, if you've published, you know, if it's 5 of 6 chapters, that's probably going to, you know, mean fewer sales of the book itself, because so many people can get access them through their libraries. But if it's even maybe up to half, but you know, sort of 2/5 is for me a sort of a good benchmark.
Mahinder, that's a helpful transition into how worried should I be about the peer review process? Well, I'll start and say, you know, for a big distinction between how journals peer review often works and books peer reviews. When we send books out for review, you know, we don't send out everything that comes our way, and we're not looking for the reviewers to deliver us a yes, no verdict. An editor sending your book out for review already means they see it as a Penn book or a Cornell book or a Bloomsbury book. They're invested in it. You know, we pay our peer reviewers. If your editor is sending your materials out for review, especially if it's a full manuscript, they really want it to succeed almost as much as you do. You know, for books peer review, we're really looking, for other scholars to vet the book, but also just to give feedback that will help that book go out into the world as the strongest version of itself. And then also for us to be able to then make a case to our faculty board, based on this information we have, I think that this would be a great, Cornell book or, a book at whichever press you're publishing with.
Yeah. I would just add to that. I think it's good to look at it as just another level of feedback, that you'll have already been accumulating in terms of your research and career. It's not a kind of cold take on your research, which no one else has looked at. You'll have already published several academic papers. Probably at that point, you're kind of, speaking to research, which has already been reviewed and is just getting to this book length stage. So I think it is a good idea to run it by trusted colleagues and peers before the anonymous peer review process. We still do anonymous peer review, not double, just one-sided, so that the author doesn't know. But yeah, I think it's just a normal process of feedback and criticism, which can be quite extensive, and we still keep the project, like Jenny said. I think it is very true. If you send something out for review as an editor, you do want it to succeed, because otherwise it would just be a waste of everyone's time. So to get to that stage, it's already at quite a high level. Yeah.
And I would just add, I find it, you know, I can probably count on less than the fingers of one hand how many times I've gotten a really hostile peer review. And in almost every case, it is a collaborative rather than an adversarial position, sort of process. And the scholars we approach to write peer reviews for us, they also want to see the project succeed. And even if they end up saying it's not, you know, you shouldn't publish this, very rarely is it you should never consider publishing this. Rather, it's this is still in a fairly rough stage. Here's some ideas how the author might improve it. But I would say, you know, 80% of the peer reviews I get back are, this is great, you should definitely publish it. And then the difference between the peer reviews is how much work does the author have to do? And sometimes I've gotten peer reviews that are, you know, 2 pages long. I recently got a peer review that was 69 pages long that I just dreaded reading because it was so long. It was so well informed and quite witty, but it was literally 69 pages long. And the book was only like 80,000 words. So I think the review and the book were sort of in competition. But it was a really helpful review. And I think that's what the process is. It really is, as both Jenny and Jade have said, it's really intended to make sure that the version of the book or of the manuscript that's being published is the best it can be.
So how do publishers decide how each book gets treated after publication in terms of printing strategy, pricing, and marketing?
I can start this one in part because it follows on from the pre-board meeting I spoke about, which is where the editors present the books to their colleagues at the press to decide if we should move forward. And at that stage is when we start having the very first conversations about what kind of book it's going to be. The marketing manager will weigh in and decide sort of from his experience and from the comparable sales. Oh, it looks like it might sell this many copies in the first 12 months. You know, a price point of this would probably be really attractive. Here are some good audiences that you didn't think of. So that's really, and from that stage, that sort of is the first iteration. And it really is from that point on an iterative process where depending, you know, if the book comes in at 80,000 or the contracted for 80,000 words and it comes in at 160,000 words, that's going to change a lot of discussions about how saleable the book is, how we can price it, how we might print it. And then there's a series of conversations that take place over the course, the life of the book before, even after it, immediately after it goes into production, about how the book will be treated, how excited our colleagues in marketing are, what kind of resources are going to be used to design the book and then to sell it and promote it.
Yeah, I'll add to that. These decisions are often made based on the press's sense of the market for your book, but also different presses simply just have different models. For example, at some presses, there might be more internal discussion about these decisions. At Penn Press, for example, if your book is in medieval and early modern studies, other than sort of a very small number of exceptions, you know, it'll probably be a hardcover book costing around between, you know, $50 to $70. If you are an anthropologist publishing with Penn Press, your book will be published in simultaneous paperback and hardcover, with the paperback more affordably priced, because this is what the press has determined works for us in those markets. I'd say if these considerations are important to you, or things like you know, open access, these are all good conversations to have with editors and presses before you make a commitment and then you're told, oh no, we don't do open access, or we can only do it if, you know, you give us a subsidy of, you know, X amount of money, or oh, we can't guarantee you a paperback.
Yeah, and just to add, similarly, we're always kind of working with our own internal categories of books that we publish. So for Arden, we always have our standard hardback monographs, which kind of relate to our reference publishing as well. And that's always hardback, priced higher for a library market, for example. Any books that kind of reach beyond that, tend to be pitching to a wider audience, still academic. So there is a point at which someone probably becomes high profile enough that they have a trade author, and then it's not so much a crossover academic book, but where you're still kind of pitching to a mainly academic audience, it would be very much built into the project initially, in terms of how it's being written, who you're saying the market is. And yeah, that's kind of something that would be conceived at proposal stage, and hopefully it would be, yeah, a book that would be coming after the monograph if you're following the standard academic route. Not everyone does, and sometimes people do publish those types of books earlier on in their career, and that can be a really exciting thing to do. So yeah, I think I'd recommend looking at book catalogs and start to notice the different price points that you see and who those authors are if you're interested in those different types of publishing, on the book level and who it's going to reach, for example.
Okay, here's our last prepared question that we can hopefully answer fast and then open it up to Q&A. How collaborative is the author-editor collaboration? Do one of you want to take that?
Do you want to go, Mahinder?
Yes, I can. So the editor-author collaboration, it really depends on the project, and there's no one model, and it also depends on how much edit time the editor has. So I would say that in some cases a manuscript comes, and it also depends on the manuscript. In some cases, if the manuscript comes in, there's a clear case for publication. It's well written, it's well argued. The peer reviews all say, great, you basically go ahead and publish this with a very few revisions. I'm probably not going to have a lot to say about the manuscript itself. In some cases, after I've read, when an author has submitted the manuscript and I've read through it, I might say, oh, this is great, but the introduction, I'm still confused about the introduction. I'm not sure, the introduction doesn't tell me what the book is about. I think before I send it out for peer review, would you be willing to sort of try and redraft the introduction and sort of, you say on page 28, this is what the book is about, can you move that to page 2? And then in a very few cases, it's a much more involved process with the author, which is often very fulfilling. I don't have time, unfortunately, to do that with every book. But there are some cases where, I signed up a project enthusiastically. The topic is great. It's something I actually know something about. And then I get the manuscript and it's not what I hoped. And in those cases, those are the ones where I'm like, oh, you know what? I really want to make sure that this book realizes its full potential, and I will put in more effort. But I would say that relationship that you have with the author, that an editor has an author, tends to persist, as Jade said, across projects. And so usually, if the relationship has been a pretty good one, we'll get the second book, that author's second book and their third book. And I think one of my colleagues has had, some of his authors have published 13 or 14 books with them. And so that relationship, in terms of not the project itself, but in terms of the trust built between an editor and author, that you're going to treat my book well and you're going to deliver a manuscript that I know is going to work out for us. And we want to, so, and then at the very specific level, the editor tends to be the person who, when there's an issue somewhere else in the publishing process, the author comes to the editor first, usually, and sort of says, marketing is doing this with my book. Can you help out and explain why they're doing this? Or, oh, I don't really love the cover design I just got. What do you say about it? How did that happen, kind of thing. So there's that kind of troubleshooting relationship that takes place as well throughout.
Yeah, just to add quickly, I think it is quite a nice collaborative relationship, at least on Arden, with our authors, in the sense that we try to be a part of the early modern Shakespeare studies community, and we really want to champion our authors' research, beyond just publishing someone's book. We're interested in attending their events and knowing who the scholars that they're in conversation with are, and contributing in that sense. So it's not always just the formal book process, the editor-author relationship where you get the collaboration. Sometimes it's kind of making sure that you're, at conferences like this, for example, and like Mahinder said, having a kind of longer term relationship, which isn't just focused on one book project. So we do kind of aim for that, and that can be unique to a press or unique to an editor and author. So it's kind of good to get a sense of that when you start reaching out to people. Is this someone who I want to work with for a few years, or is this like a press that I like the look of, what they're doing, etc.
I don't have much to add to those answers, but we have some time to answer questions from any of you.
Yes.
Thank you. That was wonderful and very informative. I was wondering if you also publish articles, and if you could maybe talk about the difference between an edited collection and maybe just submitting independently, and also the timeline between submitting and it actually getting published.
So I'll start as someone from a press that does books and journals. Those processes tend to be pretty separate, even though we do journals that are related to my areas. I don't, as a books acquisitions editor, I don't work with journals at all. Usually submissions of articles go directly through whatever process that individual journal has, which at the beginning stage might not directly involve anyone actually at the press. From the book side, edited collections, generally those start as a proposal for a collection where the volume editors tend to have an idea for the collection, and I would say probably more often than not tend to already have a pretty firm idea of who's going to be in the collection. That's not always the case. I've seen proposals for collections or been informally approached about collections that then kind of go out as CFPs, or that, still are a little speculative. But that's another process where I'm almost never directly involved with the selection of pieces in an edited volume. That work is done by the volume editors, sometimes with consultation from me if it's at an earlier stage. But I think especially as presses who do books undergo sort of more and more financial pressures due to things going on in the university and humanities. I think fewer presses are doing edited collections, so that also might be a process that doesn't necessarily look the same way that it might have 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, and you asked about the schedule for how long it takes, right? Yeah. So for books, when we get a proposal, we tend to try and review it within 6 to 12 weeks, I'll say, depending on who's available and what review feedback we get and how quickly it comes. From there, in terms of contracting the book, we have publishing meetings that at Bloomsbury are monthly, so that can add a bit more time into the schedule. And then, yeah, it really just depends on what the author's own schedule is. People kind of tend to be balancing a lot of different commitments. So yeah, it can be 2 to 3 years, if not more. So yeah, you get about a 3 to 4 year process minimum, I'd say. We have a production process that's 7 months. I don't know what it is at other presses. It tends to be quite standard there. And yeah, distribution is like a few months, printing and stuff. So that's like a rough timeline.
At Cornell, it's a 11-month sort of from transmittal, which is when we put the manuscript into production, to finished books at the other end.
Yeah,
So
Penn is similar, and I would say probably most university presses other than maybe Oxford and Cambridge, who I think are a little faster. That's a pretty standard timeline. I just always say it probably takes longer than you're expecting.
Yeah, I usually, it's always helpful, whichever editor you're talking to, if you have a real, if you have a 10-year deadline, let the editor know, even if you think, oh, well, that's 2 years away, I don't need to worry about that. Just let them know, because things get delayed, and we can't always, and I think our official policy, we don't accelerate projects because of things like 10-year promotion. But if we know that this is coming up and things are moving a little slowly, it's just helpful to know, and we can sort of keep you in the loop. And for us, the biggest two variables are how long it's going to take you to revise the manuscript, and sort of bring it into publishable shape, and also the peer review process, which used to be pretty routinely like I gave 10 weeks to peer reviewers to turn in their reports, and I would get reviews in sort of 9 to 12 weeks. And now, I mean, I'm still waiting for 3, 4, 5 months for peer review sometimes, just because of everything that's gone on in the world. So those are the two real variables, and my own time, and I can get easily sort of distracted by other projects. But I would say, yeah, 2 to 3 years is a good rule of thumb for most projects from the time that you sort of submit a reviewable manuscript.
So one of my romantic studies, one of my romantic studies colleagues, Travis Lau, sort of really, and it speaks to sort of the last question that you were throwing around the round table yourselves, talked about the importance of that collaborative relationship between editor and author. And I would just love to hear more from you all about the sort of specific philosophies that you bring to that collaborative effort.
Yeah, I'll say that I think that many acquisitions editors probably feel this way. I really see the role of an acquisitions editor as being an advocate for the author in the book, both externally through the peer review process, but also internally at the press. And as Mahinder mentioned, right, if anything arises, sort of questions about cover design, the author, something has come up with the author has some sort of concerns, the acquisitions editor is not only, the author's first point of contact often, but also the person at the press whose role it is to advocate for the author in various processes. So that relationship of trust is really, really important. And I think especially with first-time authors, authors from like minoritized or marginalized backgrounds, there's often a sense that, the press and the publisher and the editor are this like powerful entity, and I'm sort of in this position of like almost like applying for a job or sort of like throwing yourself at the press's mercy. But the author is a really important part of the process, without which the book and, the press wouldn't exist. And I encourage authors to think of themselves as sort of empowered participants in the process, ask things of your editor, even if you aren't necessarily asked about this, offer suggestions about, what kind of peer reviewers you want to see for the book. If you have concerns about peer review, if you have concerns about any part of the process, right? I think that how I see that collaborative role is that the editor is really there to facilitate that interaction more than, the kind of editing that we often don't have time to do, which is like the sort of developmental editing, line editing. That kind of collaboration is not necessarily something I have time to make the center of my role, whereas, being the advocate for the author in the book is something that I think is central to every part of the process.
Yeah, and I think it probably varies by press size as well. So for example, an editor at Cambridge is supposed to be publishing 70 books a year or something like that. I think that's what the politics editor does at Cambridge. I'm responsible for 24 to sort of 30 books, and that's probably too many. So I have a little more time per author, per project to spend. And I think that's probably true that sort of the smaller presses, the editors have a little more, the smaller the press, the more time the editor has to spend on the project. But I agree, it's interesting that it was someone, a romanticist, who asked that question, because when you go into publishing, you imagine like Maxwell Perkins is going to be, putting back shots with Hemingway and working word after word. And that's not actually, sadly, how it happens. And it really is, I think, as Jenny said, being an advocate for the project, even within the press, where I find myself saying, no, this is a really cool book. And, someone in the marketing department may be like, oh, it seems fairly standard, blah, blah, blah. And so it's up to me, I think, to say, oh, then I brought this project forward badly, because really what's cool about it is this aspect that I didn't talk about when we launched the book. And this might be a way to find a slightly different readership for this. So I think that's what our primary role is.
Hi, yes, so thank you all. I had a question about the dissertation and turning that into a book. I believe Jade, you mentioned that you work with faculty throughout their careers. So for junior faculty, early career faculty who are wanting to turn their dissertation into a book, how fully formed is that dissertation typically from a publishing standpoint, and maybe what does it need if it falls quite short? So any tips or strategies regarding that?
Yeah, I think we tend to have like some standard guides actually that we send out to PhD students, probably who have received their accreditation in that sense. So we don't tend to accept proposals for dissertations which aren't published, or for people that haven't received their PhDs yet, just because it kind of makes sense to work with the project as it's completed. At least that tends to be our advice, and we kind of just recommend that you cut things like the critical survey that's very much to do with the academic side of submitting it to a university and not submitting it to a press. So there are just some standard things that you can go through in terms of word length and critical literature that's in there in the way it's put together, which wouldn't belong in a kind of first monograph academic book. But yeah, it tends to be something that you can get in touch about, and we have standard guides which we can share with you if it'd be helpful.
Yeah, I'd say that most presses will publish books that are based on dissertations, books that are usually heavily revised from dissertations, but not dissertations themselves. And like, to me, the things that I look for that distinguish something that sounds like a book from a dissertation is, foremost a sense of audience. The dissertation is usually written, for a readership of 3 to 5 people who want to see that you have the scholarly chops to be awarded a degree, whereas the audience for the book is the sort of broader group of people who want to read the book, not to assess how smart you are, but because they want to take something away from it that's relevant to them. So often the book should have a more clearly and persuasively developed sense of argument, which of course is tied to audience, right? Like, what are you arguing, not just for the sake of arguing, but what are you saying that's informed by the conversations going on in your field and discipline, and how does it change the future outlook of that field or that discipline in light of the work that you're doing in the book. So often the way that the book will be framed and the way that argument will be framed is a bit more sort of a broadening out, rather than in a dissertation, often a sort of like digging in and getting into the weeds.
Yeah, I mean, we often say that the dissertation is written for 3 people and that the book is written for hopefully 300 or 3,000 people. And those 300 or 3,000 people don't know the subject as well as your dissertation committee. And so there's a broadening of the language and the concepts perhaps. But also you're not trying to prove anything to these readers. So, the first thing we do is say, get rid of the literature review in the first chapter. Nobody needs to know at this point the book's all the homework you've done to write this document. So that can come out. And then standard, what we call dissertation ease, is what is sort of scaffolding. In this book, I will show that. In this chapter, I will show that. At the end of this chapter, I have shown that. You now know that, all of that stuff comes out, and it's much more the book. We're trying to get you to try. I actually just told this to an author this morning. Trust the reader more, that they are going to be interested in what you're writing about, because they don't have to read this. They've picked it up. They want to read it. And so trust that they are going to read through it, and that you don't have to sort of keep reminding them why they're reading it. Yeah.
So the 100,000 words, what is that? Is that everything? The 100,000 words, that will be from table of content to index.
Yeah, so Yeah, that's a really good question, right? If your limit is 100,000 words, what does that include? So generally it includes everything except for the index, because you're not able to turn the index in at the time that you submit the manuscript to go into production. But it does, right? It does include, all your front matter, your table of contents, most pertinently, and something people ask about, it includes your notes and it includes your bibliography. All of that is included in whatever word count expectations there are.
Yeah, it's the same. I'll just keep it short.
Are there any more? I have one more, but if there's another question, I want to defer.
Go for it.
Okay, cool. So I'm interested personally in the sort of politics of publishing, right? Because it seems like as academics, many of us are always looking for the right comrades, right? And part of being a good comrade is doing right by your comrade. So sort of, it's a two-part question, I guess, the sort of politics of academic publishing. Do you have thoughts about that sort of in general? And then the other part, or the second part of the question is what can we do sort of be good comrades of yours, in the process of working with you, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I like the idea of being comrades with my authors. What was the first part of the question? Sorry.
Do you have
the
thoughts in
politics of
general?
publishing. Yeah, it's quite broad, isn't it? I think what's important for us, working within the publishing frameworks that we do, the kind of push to publish a certain number of books, is to have work that we really care about, like we were saying in terms of your question on philosophies and how do we choose the books that we choose and who do we work with. I think it's trying to kind of find the research that we do want to champion and care about within those frameworks that kind of can be not great for either the researcher or the publisher. So I think it's kind of like a way of coming to conferences like this and really learning about people's research is a way to move beyond some of the more overarching structures that limit what we can publish. But yeah. I can also
Buy more books. recommend to your libraries that they buy more books.
Yeah, I think just adding to that, I think just recognizing that academic publishing, university presses in particular, because of our dependence on universities, but all of academic publishing, kind of exists in the same situation of, increasing labor precarity and, defunding of, the university and the humanities that academia does as well, right? And that affects everything from our working conditions to, the sorts of decisions that we might be able to make about what we publish. I mean, I think it's a really tough question, the sort of politics of publishing, because, just like academia, it can be hard to assess, sort of what an organization's values might be, from the inside versus the outside. And meanwhile, we're all sort of in this situation where we're doing this to make a living. But, I would say I appreciate the question about being good comrades to editors and publishers. And I would say, for the sake of, your publishers, just remember that, we are all people trying our best. And, often when it seems like, oh, the press is really letting authors down, by not doing this well, it's it's one person who has COVID or is on vacation or, just has a lot going on. But I would say, also on the author side, I think author experience is also really important, knowing if you have friends who've been through the experience, how how they were treated, how they were advocated for in the process, really feeling that your press or your editor has your back. I would say that's important too. And I would say, we were talking about how important that collaborative relationship is, and work with someone that you feel, is not only a good fit in terms of, I want my book to have, the imprimatur of this press, but someone who you feel that you can trust to advocate for you in that way, I think is probably the best you can do.
Well, thank you all so much. And we hope to see you all back for a future IHR event.